So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Raju Hajela. As he mentioned a little bit earlier, we've known each other for about 10 years. And the one thing that's coming to mind right now for me, and even after watching Howard's presentation, is the safety and the courtesy and respect I think I received from you when we first met. And I came to see Raju. I call him Raju. I do believe we all are equals, so that's part of the reasoning. Because I need a doctor's note to not get kicked out of school. And so somebody told me about this addiction physician that would do that for me. So I booked an appointment and said, hey, will you write me a doctor's note? And he's like, sure. And he says, but I hope you'll come and continue to see me. And my experience with the system wasn't well. And I was like, why would I do that? Like, what can you offer? And he said, I'm hoping that I can teach you how to trust yourself again. I went, whoa, that is something I am interested in. And the other thing I want to bring up is I asked him too, I said, well, do I have to stop using drugs and alcohol to see you? He's like, no, that's not a priority, not an issue. And I'm like, wow, that doesn't make any sense to me. I know, everybody else demands that you stop now, otherwise you're not ready for help. You don't want it bad enough. And I remember he has, today in his clinic, he has a system, like you put a $200 deposit, and if you miss your appointment, you lose the deposit and have to pay again. And I think that's a fair system. Of course, I didn't like it at the time, but if I was in Calgary and I was high, I went to see him a couple times, and it still blew my mind that a professional would see me high. So it's an absolute honor and a pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Raju Hajela.
Thank you, Corey. It is overwhelming to be standing here before you to hear Howard just a few minutes before and recognize so many faces in the room that I've known over the years, and all a testament to recovery. And I do want to thank Fresh Start for this amazing venue, and whoever selected the background music, which I expect is Sue, is also very touching personally to me, because I grew up in India, and Sanskrit is something that I learned growing up, and a lot of the music in yoga studios is very, very familiar to me. So I was inspired to start my presentation by reciting a hymn to Ganesh. And those of you who've been to the Hum offices may have seen there is a statue of Ganesh that came back with Sue and I from our trip to India in October. So here it goes. Vakratunde Mahakaya Suryakoti Samaprabha Nirvignam Kurme Deva Sarvkarvishu Sarvada. What that means is that there are no endings. There are only beginnings, and we are standing at a new beginning. And this is actually a concept in physics, because we live in an ever-expanding universe, and each moment and each day we have an opportunity to open our lives in a new direction. So that is what Ganesh is all about. So I call for Ganesha's energy to be with me and to be with you for this new beginning that Howard has also implored us to embark on. And hopefully you can see the synergy that the Foundation for Addiction Mental Health has with the cutting edge of what some of us are trying to do nationally in North America, between US and Canada, but also internationally. And International Society of Addiction Medicine is also something that I'm very much a part of. And a lot of the stuff that I'll be sharing with you is stuff that has been shared with audiences all over the world. My time is limited, as I was saying, that I'm standing between you and lunch, so I will aim to finish in about 50 minutes. I do have a fair number of slides. Some of them I'll race through fairly quickly, but this afternoon is going to be a little bit more relaxed, and you'll have a chance to ask more questions. And some of you who feel really strongly compelled to write what's on the slides, I can promise you that these slides will be posted on the FAMH website, so you're not going to miss out. So bear with me, and this is going to be a fast-paced talk about addiction, but also about recovery. Howard has already set the stage, so hopefully you'll be able to follow as to how we translate what is going wrong in the brain into recovery, and how recovery helps your brain function better. And that's the key thing, and I'm glad that Corey mentioned what he did, and I often say this, that just because you've stopped using drugs and alcohol doesn't mean you're doing better. And just because you haven't stopped, it doesn't mean that you're doing badly. So the key is recovery, and I'll go over the definitions of abstinence and recovery that we've developed up over the last couple of decades. So it's going to be a romp through history and bring you to the present and perhaps provide some direction to the future. Personally, for me, those of you who know me know some of this, but many of you don't. But I started out in medical school in 1978, and seeing alcohol and drug-related problems being mismanaged in hospitals was very depressing. Sadly, that situation, almost 40 years later, is not that different. I was lucky. I was introduced to AA in 1979 by a wonderful family doctor at the time whose name was Dr. John Savage. And those of you from Nova Scotia may recognize that name because John Savage gave up medical practice. I think he was dissatisfied with the system, and he went into politics. He actually became the premier of Nova Scotia in the 90s, and then he died an untimely death with cancer. So he managed to get a few people together, and I was amazed at what Alcoholics Anonymous had to offer. So I'll be reviewing some of the stuff that has happened in the 12-step movement too. I also was in the Canadian Forces. Treating alcohol-related problems in the Canadian Forces was part of my job. So I started treating people with addiction and became an addiction doctor very early in my career, going back to 1983, which is when I came into active service. So some of my understanding and passion has been driven by that, because we all laughed when Howard was presenting. The military had no drug problem because drugs were illegal. But as I was treating my alcohol-related problem patients, alcoholics as they were called, they all had drug use histories. So what do we do with that? And certainly we couldn't write it down officially, even let alone that somebody find out. So, and at that time in the 80s, those of you who've been around treatment systems may know that alcohol-related problems were treated separately. There were programs for alcoholics and there were programs for drug addicts, despite the fact it's the same disease. And of course, as I progressed further and I managed to, in the military, get the name changed from Alcoholism Rehabilitation Center to Addiction Rehabilitation Center, which still just included drugs, to get beyond substances, came through the 90s. And I will walk you through a bit of that as to how that change happened. I left the military in 94, 95, and was practicing in Kingston, teaching at Queen's University, and that continued until 2006, which is when I came to Calgary at the behest of University of Calgary. But again, those of you who know me know details of this story, that I ended up quitting University of Calgary about 10 years ago because of all the politics and Calgary Health Region and Alberta Health Services stuff. Now, having said that, because I'm a physician, I am covered by the provincial healthcare plan, so I can't be separate either. And we do get a lot of medical students and residents through HUM, the Health Upwardly Mobile Practice and company that we have set up now for over the last 8 years. The University of Calgary is twisting my arm to go back on faculty. So that association is going to come back. But as the slide says, that most of our treatment program at HUM is directed towards addiction beyond substances. That doesn't mean that we don't address substance-related issues, but the bulk of it is beyond substances with individual and group psychotherapy, biopsychosocial, spiritual stuff, the comprehensive assessment that Corey has already talked to you about, and encouraging mutual support, and specifically mutual support through 12-step programs and something called RARE, which I'll talk a little bit more about as well. And the intensive outpatient program that we started at HUM is now in its 5th year, and there is one starting on Monday, which we are really looking forward to, and having a new group of people who in some ways are a new group of people for the IOP, but the best thing about our treatment program is that we hit the ground running. Everybody who comes on the IOP is already a patient, and when the program finishes, they do not graduate, they continue on in their recovery journey that we are privileged to be a part of. You've seen this slide. I included it in my slide set to remind us and me that this is the problem. As much as addiction and mental health problems are treated separately, I think the real change won't happen until the system starts looking at addiction and mental health problems with every single health condition. We are far away from that. So my goal is even more, in many ways, broader than what Howard has suggested. And actually, Howard gave this talk a year ago in Vegas, and even his life has shifted. And he has started a huge initiative of trying to include some of this stuff. And I wasn't sure if he was going to include that in his presentation. I think if he was here in person, he might have. But keep an eye open for looking for Howard Wetzman and something called the Dragon's Bane Project. And I'm happy to be involved in that too, to try and get people's attention to look at the addiction-related problems that contribute to problems every day. And here's the slide that also Corey shared, that if 50% is rooted in addiction, and that's a conservative estimate, 1.2 million Albertans are affected. But the numbers are actually even more staggering. And I would say, if you look at it the other way, which is what also Howard implied, that recovery is something that all of us need. So this is a problem that needs to be addressed by every single Albertan. And if you can think of that if these problems are addressed and we can decrease the morbidity and mortality burden, which is the technical term that we use to describe the costs associated with physical health problems, we'd be off to the races. And the money that would be saved in our healthcare system at that level could be put to much better use. Having said that, we can't do it ourselves. As a professional, I can't do it. We need all of you in the audience, and that is my hope for every one of you that's in the audience. You will talk to at least 10 other people to make them more aware as to how we can move forward. And this slide as well, I wanted to include that Corey showed you, but just to put a slightly different spin, that when Howard was talking about 10 to 20% of the population being affected by addiction, he was only talking about the severe addiction. When we include moderate addiction and we include mild addiction, we're talking about a condition that is more the norm. The numbers are likely closer to 2/3 of the human population around the world has the genetic predisposition to this disease, which makes them vulnerable such that they cannot enjoy the optimum quality of life. And sadly, in our society, the optimum quality of life is defined by what toys we have, rather than who we are as people. And I hope that's the message that you'll take home, and certainly my talk will address that. But this afternoon, when you hear personal stories by Lisa and Paul and their personal journeys, and perhaps you'll be inspired to share some of your own journeys, that we can all move towards optimum health collectively. This slide also you've seen, are you in a cage? Is the question I ask people. You don't need to be. It's addiction that puts you in the cage. It's a screening test that Paul Ewing developed in 1972, so it's been around with us for a long time. Originally developed for alcohol, but in the 80s it got modified to include drugs. So CAGE 8 stands for alcohol including drugs. But we've been using this 4-question instrument just to ask people to screen for addiction. But it is a screening test. It's not diagnostic. It is applicable. So if you're sitting there and wondering if something in your life is interfering with the best quality of life, is it addiction related or not? Ask these 4 questions, whether it's related to food or relationships or job or power or control. You'll start to get the answer. A brief history of the 12-step programs. 1939, as Howard said, was an amazing year, but actually the meeting between Dr. Bob and Bill Smith, who started AA, happened in 1935. So AA has also been with us for a long time, and as the slide says, there are over 60,000 groups in 180 countries. And people have their own feelings about whether AA is effective or not, but I can tell you that is the biggest pool of recovering people that you'll find anywhere in the world. And that is the guarantee that if you go to an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, and I've had patients that have gone traveling and they've gone to meetings where they don't understand what is being talked about, and they've made the comment that in some ways it is better. Because AA is not about what you say and hear there necessarily, it's about how you feel there. It's what happens to your amygdala when you're there, not what happens to your cortex. So I hope you'll be attentive to that and appreciate that Narcotics Anonymous didn't come into being until the early 1950s, or early 50s, and then 1983 was when the basic text was written. So NA has a more checkered past than AA does. Gamblers Anonymous, interestingly enough, got established in 1957, but has not gained as much traction. And largely because, as Howard was joking about, people go to get one addiction treated and then go on with another one. And Gamblers Anonymous, unfortunately, still has meetings where people go drinking afterwards. So it's hard to get into recovery when the disease is active in some other area. Overeaters Anonymous goes back to 1958. Interestingly enough, the history is that Roseanne S. announced the formation of Overeaters Anonymous actually at a Gamblers Anonymous meeting. So this idea that addiction is not new. It's always been there. But people have been very slow in catching on because of this idea of addicted to. And one of the biggest shifts we've done in the last 10 years specifically, and in our book, Addiction is Addiction, that Dave mentioned, that Sue and Paige are sitting at on the side table that you're welcome to look at, we have changed the language to say addiction involving. And I'm happy to report that amongst my colleagues in the American Society of Addiction Medicine, that tide is slowly shifting. But as you also heard from Howard, DSM still rules, and most of our colleagues are still very beholden to the psychiatric system, which I'll also talk a little bit more about later. But Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous was founded in 1976. When I came to Calgary, there was no Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous program here. I'm gratified that many of our patients have started. There has been a Sex Addicts Anonymous program in Calgary, SAA and SA, and those are also programs that got started in the 70s, 77 and 79 respectively. Anorexics and Bulimics Anonymous is actually an Alberta-based program started by a physician in Edmonton in 1993. So the history of 12-step programs is very interesting, and I'd encourage all of you who are in recovery to just become a little bit more familiar rather than being frustrated by what you see sometimes and just leaving. If you become familiar with the history, then you'll have a little bit more awareness and understanding as to where the difficulties lie, and it is really up to us to bridge the gap. And in bridging the gap is where we have started RARE, and I'll share more about that too. Now, as you have already heard me say about being from India and learning about addiction from a Western medical perspective, and this is something from the Bhagavad Gita, which is also something that I think those of you who are familiar with yoga circles and Vedic texts, you would have come across it. And this is a simple diagram that comes out of just 2 passages in the Gita. And the first one says, Dhyayato Vishyanpansa Sangostupjayate. Sangostupjayate kama, kama krodha pujayate. Simply put, you heard the idea of attachment. And the passages in the Gita say that when our senses, the 5 senses, interact with the environment, attachment is something that will naturally arise. We cannot avoid that. The question is, how do we deal with that? If we have a healthy functioning brain, it says, yes, I desire this, it is enough, and I can go on with my life. But if I have addiction, or if I'm stressed out and my dopamine tone is not where it needs to be, then I want more, more, more. And even there, the problem related to addiction can be pretty tame. And this is where with mild addiction, that's where problems often stop at the desire level, going on to the anger level a little bit. And that's the first passage I read for you. But when anger starts to persist, and that's the second passage that says, Krodhat bhavati sammoha, sammoha bhavati vibramaha, vibramanshad buddhinasho, buddhinasha pranashyati, which is the second part of the slide that if anger, this particular passage only talks about anger, but we know from addiction perspective, we also need to address fear and shame. If that is not addressed, and that is what is generated by the disease, then you get into illusions and delusions. And that's when the memory system starts to get totally messed up. And Buddha, those of you who are familiar with Buddhism, Buddha is a Sanskrit word which basically refers to intellect. So Buddha is actually a title given to someone who is enlightened or very knowledgeable. So the word intelligence and buddhi are synonymous. So the Sanskrit word buddhi is the intelligence. So buddhi nasho pranashiti, meaning once your intelligence is destroyed, everything is destroyed. And at that level, the intelligence is not at the level of the cortex, which is what we think is the brain. The intelligence has to be at the level of the midbrain. So I hope if you forget anything else today, you'll remember the midbrain and dopamine tone and talk about it with people and read about it and explore all the things that we know that increase dopamine tone and keep that tone high such that, and this is the research on transcendental meditation, if you're familiar with it, and if you look into it, you'll see that without any other intervention, just the intervention of meditation and yoga starts to change the brain. So we haven't necessarily changed the genetics, but we can change the way the genetics expresses itself. And that's the whole point when Howard says end addiction. End addiction is not to cure addiction because we cannot cure that, it's a primary disease, but we can make a huge intervention such that the problems related to the disease are brought to a minimum, and that really is the prevention aspect. This is an old slide. I included it just for completeness sake to give you a sense that in 1999, this is the definition of addiction that we established in the Canadian Society of Addiction Medicine. But over the next decade, changes happened such that we were able to expand it. Or even in 1999, we were able to include behaviors, addiction beyond substances, and have all of this included, and have biopsychosocial spiritual the way it is in the new definition as well. Because Alan Leshner in 1990, as Howard was saying too, declared the 1990s as the decade of the brain, and we started learning about all of this. And if you guys want to learn more about it in some complicated ways, but NIDA tries to make the information as simple as possible, you can go to the NIDA website, and it is still called National Institute on Drug Abuse, but the current director, Nora Volkow, has been very passionate about trying to change the name to National Institute of Addictive Diseases, or Addiction and diseases related to that, diseases of addiction. So National Institute on Diseases of Addiction would be the new name, and if you think of that, diseases of addiction includes all physical health problems too. And a lot of research in NIDA is actually devoted towards HIV prevention, which is not a mental health problem, not a drug-related problem as addiction, but certainly in terms of spreading infectious disease. Having said all of that, over the 2000s is when we started to specifically talk to colleagues about what addiction really is. And this is just the schematic of what we developed that led to the recognition that regardless of the substance or behavior you might be engaging in, it's the dopamine receptors that are the problem. And Nora Volkow, whose name I mentioned, she's the current director of NIDA, in 2006, she published a paper that says high levels of dopamine receptors seem to protect against addiction, meaning manifestation of addiction, while low levels increase vulnerability. And her research was on food and drugs, not just drugs. And levels are affected by genetics and then whatever the environmental exposure is. And relapse is associated with re-exposure to the substance, environment, and increased stressors. So we have the research that shows us as to where exactly the lesion is in the brain, which is why I find it totally puzzling when people argue that this is not a disease, that this is a social problem. So I hope you'll recognize that and take home this definition if you don't know it already, and become familiar with it. You've seen it a couple of times before today, but I hope you'll look at it some more. And like anything else, the more you look at it, the more it'll start to make sense as to what it's all about. And Corey had a version of this slide, and I also still say CCSA's Canadian Centre on Substance Abuse, and I was thinking of it, but I forgot to change it earlier. But just a few months ago, the Canadian Centre on Substance Abuse, after me personally and many other people lobbying them, in January of 2015, they adopted the definition, and a few months ago, they changed their name. They're now called Canadian Centre on Substance and Addiction. So they didn't change the CCSA acronym, but they changed it to CCSA just as we are lobbying, and I hope it'll happen in the next decade, although the election south of the border recently has changed things around, but we hope we'll get to the National Institute on Disease of Addiction. And as I'm telling you that, I can tell you one other thing that we have started, but it's in its infancy, and I don't have any slides on that, that we're trying to develop a manual, a system, where it'll be assessment and diagnoses in addiction medicine, something we're going to call ADAM, which means that all the diagnoses that may be away from addiction medicine right now need to be brought in under the same umbrella. So when diabetes is treated, it's not just diabetes that is being treated. If the person has addiction involving food, that is addressed as well. Similarly, it's not just cardiovascular disease or cancer that is being treated. Whatever the addiction-related causes that was in the slide that Corey showed and what I shared with you will be addressed as well. You've seen this slide as well, so I won't belabor it, but I hope you'll take it home and look at it. That the key thing in order to try and get even an addicted brain to go to a healthy functioning is to focus on improving your brain function. And the executive functioning, as Howard said, and I can't emphasize that enough, doesn't happen top down. It has to happen from bottom up, which is why it's the personal journey, getting connected psychosocially, spiritually, that becomes so, so important. Howard shared in just one slide at the end where research is ongoing, where we can use medications to make some interventions, but we know for a fact that medication interventions are all artificial. So we need natural interventions, and fortunately we do have them. And we have them in the form of meditation, we have them in the form of yoga, we have them in the form of 12-step programs, we have them in the form of other mutual support programs to help that drive function a little bit better rather than the disease taking over. Now, very quickly, in a few minutes, I'll share with you where DSM comes from. So this is the substance use continuum that you may be familiar with, that we talk about low-risk use, hazardous use, harmful use. And those of you who are in the field, you may know the 3 C's or 4 C's of addiction. So this is where that comes from. In the old classification that started in 1981, abuse and dependence were 2 things that were mentioned. Continued use despite negative consequences is a C related to substance abuse, and the compulsion, craving, and loss of control is what is associated with dependence, and people in the past, including me, and I kept my old slide, use them interchangeably. But as I hope you're starting to see, that we've shifted. Addiction is something more than dependence. And AA had figured this out a long time ago, and those of you who go to AA know that line, a cucumber can become a pickle, but a pickle can't go back to being a cucumber, which graphically can be seen on this. And this is where the terms up on top, abuse and dependence, are old terms, and low risk, hazardous use, harmful use, and addiction is the language we use now. Having said that, psychiatry has messed it up in the sense that abuse and dependence are gone, and this whole continuum with no attention to the pickle line is called substance use disorder, which is why one of my missions in the last little while, including in the latest issue of the Journal of Addiction Medicine, has become to get people's attention to stop using the term substance use disorders. But unfortunately, as long as psychiatry is around and unless the DSM really changes, it's not going to change. What we're trying to emphasize because of that is, let's leave psychiatry be. Addiction is a medical diagnosis. Let's not focus on just something someone does a lot. not something someone should do less, not something that is bad, not something that needs to be replaced, not a mere moral failing, and certainly not about controlling behaviors. Unfortunately, if the diagnostic system is just about behaviors and effects and labeling those as problems, then you get the chicken or egg thing. People say addiction occurs because of underlying psychiatric problems. So that backward thinking that Howard was explaining to you, I hope you'll catch that in yourself if you're caught in it, or in other people when you're talking to them. Because the flip side of it is, because of the nature of the disease of addiction and substances, it is those things that cause psychiatric problems, which is actually good news, right? Because if you treat addiction, then those problems go away. And that is really the crux of what Corey shared with you in the model where addiction is in the center. So all those psychiatric problems, they're on the periphery. If you treat the central problem, then the orbits change. A lot of people talk about self-medication. And Ed Kansian is a psychiatrist at Harvard Medical School, and he coined that term in 1985. I was privileged enough to be at Harvard 1987 to 88, and I had read the original papers that he had written. I was already astute enough, and I said to Ed, why are you doing this? And he said to me personally that it just looks like self-medication. So I said, when are you going to say that clearly? 30 years have gone by, Ed Kansian has not recanted, and I have not gone to Harvard for any continuing education. Partly, this idea arose and still is perpetuated because there is a psychodynamic explanation given rather than understanding the brain disease. As Howard explained, that in the 80s and pre-80s, the model was, there's something wrong with you, you're doing this for your benefit, not realizing that something wrong with you is really the disease, which by taking all of these things actually makes things worse rather than making it better. And this is the same reason why when psychiatry throws medications willy-nilly at people with addiction, you may for a time on the surface get better, but the long-term problems are so huge that people don't even keep track of them and often will blame something else rather than recognizing what the problem is. And the last bullet says that that's where doctors get caught in prescribing benzodiazepines, those are anti-anxiety medications, sleep medications, opioids, stimulants, hallucinogens. I don't have SSRIs on the list, but same problem. As much as serotonin is involved in the pathway, but trying to do more of that doesn't really address addiction. And now we have the latest, marijuana as a mood stabilizer, and I was horrified just last week to get a fancy brochure with a DVD with technology. I opened my mail, and this doctor pops out. Right now, he's on a screen, but I think our technology is going that I'll probably get a hologram popping out saying marijuana is the solution. And they quote studies that if you start using marijuana, you don't need as many pain pills. And the answer is, not a surprise, it's a whack-a-mole. And marijuana is not an innocuous herb. Marijuana is a hallucinogen. It is a completely different substance chemically than alcohol. So the drumbeat that says, oh, it's better than alcohol is just not true, which I hope all of you will pay attention to. So DSM-5, I have some choice words for it, and the polite one is on there. Dangerous system mental, perhaps. It's in its 5th edition, and Howard mentioned 1981, but it actually goes back even further, and I'll share that with you in the next slide. But it's atheoretical, meaning there's no theoretical basis for any of the diagnoses. It is just consensus-driven, and the validity has been questioned for the last 7 decades, yet the problems persist. There's no inter-rater reliability. No inter-rater reliability means that if you go to 2 different psychiatrists, you cannot be sure that you'll get the same diagnosis, which is why I've highlighted the diagnosis lies in the mind of the psychiatrists, or psychologists use the system too, rather than any foundation in reality, which I think you got a sense of that from Corey's model of the universe analogy and what Howard shared with you. And all these other diagnoses, oppositional defiant disorder, ADHD, BPD, which some people use that acronym for bipolar disorder, some people use that acronym for borderline personality disorder, major depressive disorder, and the list could go on. These are all diagnoses related to addiction. Sadly, our system has been such that these diagnoses exist sometimes just to give you a pill for that, or justification for billing, which is not as much an issue in Canada, but certainly a huge issue in the US. And in 2013, we're up to now 312 disorders. In 1952, DSM-1 started out with only 106 disorders. And they were called at that time, they were called reactions. So in many ways, what Howard shared with you about Dr. Silkworth, there was a recognition by physicians at that time, we don't understand enough, so these are reactions that we need to learn more about. Sadly, instead of things getting better, they went in the other direction, partly because people got hung up on thinking that we can fix everything chemically. So chlorpromazine, CPZ, was introduced in asylum medicine. So terminology is very significant. Back then, the inebriates and the insane, that's what people with mental health problems and people with addiction were called. They were sent to asylums. And they were given chlorpromazine. Now, I've been around long enough that in my training in the 70s and 80s, chlorpromazine was still big. Of course, now it's Seroquel or Zyprexa. But it is still the same thing, and we're doing stuff which is not necessarily to the benefit of the people, and it's not necessarily healthy for the brain. In '68, with DSM-2, they changed the term reactions and started calling them disorders. They increased the number from 106 to 182. 1980, 81, when DSM-3 came out, I was in medical school at that time, and I was looking at DSM-2, DSM-3. I was interested in mental health, and that alone said to me, I don't want to become a psychiatrist, which I often say, and people sometimes take me with a grain of salt, that I'm not a psychiatrist by choice. But psychiatrists refer patients to me, and I challenge psychiatrists, and just again, the nature of the beast is such that in the military and outside the military, including the invitation from University of Calgary, came from the Department of Psychiatry. My hope in coming to Calgary was we will change psychiatry. That hasn't happened, and I'm not holding my breath any longer. DSM-4 came along in 1997. We're up to 297 diagnoses. And as I said in the previous slide, DSM-5 is up to 312. And I leave it up to you. Is this really an advance, or is it creating more confusion? Because the reality of the situation is intoxication, which is whatever we take into our body creates many, many problems that are in the brain, thought disorders, mood disorders that get labeled psychiatric, and other problems in the body with various organs and neurological problems that create a disease burden for each of us individually and a society as a whole. I'm moving very fast, and if you're interested, you can actually look at this one slide. It has tremendous amount of information because each of the categories of substances listed has its own set of problems. We could have a whole day conference just on this slide. This one and the other problem, which is the problem with opioids. Opioid withdrawal is the most uncomfortable withdrawal there is, but it's not life-threatening, yet people want to die, which is why we have maintenance treatments with methadone and buprenorphine. People say then, well, why can't I have alcohol maintenance treatment or benzodiazepine maintenance treatment? It's not that you can't have it, you can have it, but it comes with a cost. With that too, we have been promoting medication-assisted recovery, which I'll mention a little bit more about, as opposed to just giving medication. Now, hallucinogen withdrawal is more subtle. Those of you who have used marijuana or have seen someone who's withdrawing from marijuana would know that it's hard to pin down. But the non-specific withdrawal symptoms, regardless of the substances that you might be taking, or even if you have addiction beyond substances as your main issue, you will get nausea, vomiting, sleep disturbance, temperature intolerance, irritability, mood swings, acting out in other ways, becoming self-centered, as Howard said. That's all part of withdrawal. It's not a permanent situation. But when the disease is active, it tells you it's permanent, and the only way out is intoxication. So this is the cycle you have to get off and appreciate that surrender is the answer as opposed to control. Not get caught up in other psychiatric conditions that somebody may diagnose for you, because addiction underlies that. And treating the psychiatric disorder does not make substance-related problems go away. Even psychiatrists know that. But they say, our job is just to treat the surface, patch you up and send you home. Many treatments as well, as Howard was saying, focus on behavior change alone. And behavior change alone is not full treatment. Because we need to address all these problems, whether it's a problem for you or not. In recovery, all of this needs to be looked at. And it is because of this simple problem, because the brain operates differently with addiction. So VTA and nucleus accumbens, you heard a lot about. You've heard about amygdala, but hippocampus is another small area of the brain which is associated with the formation of memory. So that slide of go or no go that you saw, that memory connection is related to both the hippocampus and the amygdala. And there are many neurotransmitters involved. As Howard said, to simplify it, we talk about dopamine and glutamate, but neurobiologists will tell us it is complicated. But just for ease of understanding, you can focus on those. And what are neurotransmitters? They're just natural signaling system. They're not good or bad. You don't need more or less of the other. You need balance. And our bodies make them. Because when you take a medication that increases or decreases them, it's not coming anywhere from outside. The medications are just trying to get a balance, which is why you can get depleted if you just focus on medication. And the novel therapies that Howard talked about of other microbiome introduction, that is very exciting, because then you can actually increase the production with something that your bodies may not be capable of. Now, will that solve the problem? I hope you'll take home the message. It won't solve the problem, but it'll make the problem easier to take care of. So here's another schematic. This is an actual drawing of the brain, so you can see where nucleus accumbens and ventral tegmental area are. This is the core part of the brain. The cortex cannot function without this part of the brain. So there's no top-down approach. And in some ways, we live in a world and universe where metaphors all apply. We all know that. And having been in the military, that is very big on the top-down approach. The top-down approaches don't work. That's when problems occur. It's when you increase the capacity, which is what FAMH is trying to do, what Howard is trying to do, what I've been trying to do over the last several decades of the system, that's when we can make real progress. The left side of the slide basically puts what I'm saying in just a slightly different way. When you look at the slide again, hopefully you can understand how tolerance and withdrawal drive that more circuit as well, or need to feel normal. When, as Howard described too, that over time, the spike and the low, it is a law of diminishing returns, such that you can't even get to the high spike. And that's where family members sometimes don't understand, because they say, why do you want to get high? Whereas the person who's suffering says, I'm not getting any high, I just want to survive. And that's what happens when the disease is active. And of course, it creates problems in thinking, because the brain is receiving inaccurate information from other areas. So I hope if you aren't convinced yet, and I don't want necessarily to convince you, but just get you to consider that your brain, none of our brains can distinguish between substances or processes. So even when somebody is abstinent, this is why I made the statement that even if you're abstinent, you may not necessarily be in good recovery. Whereas if you're addressing some of these things and you're not totally abstinent from substances, you are making progress in recovery. We were having that conversation with one of our patients yesterday, who I've known for 11 years, and he's been in recovery, but there are two areas that he's struggling with. One is chronic pain, and the other is relationship issues. So his disease is active. But the key that I've been encouraging him to do is focus on the strength that he has and then translate that. Because the disease imposes more shame that if you're not perfect, you're nothing. when the take-home message is that all of us are good enough, and that's where absolutely what Corey said in introducing me, we are the same. I may have more information and knowledge in one area, but as an engineer and an MBA, you know far more about other things that I don't even have a clue about. And we can help each other in the areas that we don't have the expertise in. And that's where collaboration is really the natural state of affairs. And at HUM, we actually do something more than collaboration, which is integration. Meaning we don't just collaborate as a doctor and a nurse and a psychologist, but as a doctor, I know more about nursing and psychology. Sue, as a nurse, knows more about medicine, doctor stuff, and psychology, and Paige, our psychologist, knows more about medicine and nursing than the average sort of siloed professional out there. And our system is very siloed. And with, as Greg has been working on, Corey mentioned, with primary care networks, we're trying to build collaborative teams, but I think the real progress will come when we get to integrated teams. And that integration part, hopefully you can see from a recovery perspective too. The ideas of addiction and recovery need to be made holistic. That you have to look at abstinence from substances, but look at bottom line behaviors from other things that are addiction related as well. And including chronic pain. I included this slide from my slide set from pain. And in 2004, I was in Sydney, Australia at the 11th World Congress on Pain, and Howard Fields, who's a well-known researcher in California, he made this bold statement that most rewarding drugs produce analgesia. That's just the way the brain is wired. So it's not a surprise that opioids and cannabinoids are good painkillers. But the news that some of you may know, some of you may not know, they're not painkillers. They actually just disengage your awareness from whatever is going on, such that sometimes when you're disengaged, you actually end up causing more harm to whatever part of your body may be hurting. So it is a double-edged sword, so which is why pain treatment too needs to appreciate whatever the overlap is and the interaction with addiction circuitry, and then see how we can manage that better. And the bold bullet, consumption or anticipation of reward, can inhibit responses to pain. I can tell you people with chronic pain, a simple thing like if they get into a new relationship that suddenly fantasy is lighting up the dopamine circuits, their pain decreases. We've had patients who will not disengage from acting out in that area because they say, that's when my pain is less, why do you want me to stop? So the cycle continues. And as the second bullet says, even natural rewards, they all produce a naloxone reversible analgesic effect. What that means is naloxone is an antagonist. Naloxone is the drug that's in all those kits that are being handed out to reverse overdoses. So what this means is even when no opioid has entered the system, if you're intoxicated with that and you're given an antidote for opioids, you get pain back again. So we have tons of empirical evidence that these brain circuits, and that is my main concern about marijuana. And we can argue about whether marijuana should be legal or not. I actually argue that marijuana is legal right now, even before the law is changed, because we don't have the resources to deal with the problem. Canadian Medical Association and many of us very vocally have been on record for the last several decades to decriminalize it and deal with it just as a fine system rather than a criminal offense. And that actually needs to happen with all drugs. As I stand here before you today, and I think the conference continues. Yesterday I wasn't able to go to a conference that's happening in Vancouver right now in conjunction with Recovery Day with guests from Portugal, where in Portugal in 2001 they decriminalized all drugs, which is the way to go rather than legalization. But those problems will continue because cannabinoids, they are natural ones. Endorphins and enkephalins, you guys know, are natural opioids. Endocannabinoids, the research is only about 20 years old. So one of the problems why people have such uncomfortable withdrawal is because when you start taking opioids from the outside, it shuts off the endocannabinoid system. Similarly, the cannabinoids from the outside are interfering with the endocannabinoid system because none of the drugs from outside can do everything the natural compounds do. So we need to focus on boosting the system from the inside rather than bombarding from outside. We have a ways to go in that yet. Because the real conundrum is this: where is the deficiency? Because naturally, I think all of us know our body is designed to maintain homeostasis, balance, but there are a lot of things that are disrupting. And this is just a partial list. And if you take a look at what's written there, you'll see that it's bio, psycho, social, spiritual. So to work backwards, spiritual, disruptions in life, meaning, values, and purpose. And in Ayurveda, which I've had the privilege of learning about over the last 2 decades as a physician, having grown up with it in India, it says the first primary cause of disease is pragyaparad. And pragyaparad literally translates as a mistake of the intellect. And the mistake of the intellect is that it starts to perceive itself as being separate from the rest of the universe. So being healthy requires us to come back to wholeness. So that is the spiritual foundation that actually then affects the biology, which is up on top at receptors, quantity, and function level, and withdrawal symptoms level. And social criminal behavior is the social aspect, anxiety, depression, psychosis. This is the psychological aspect. So all of this stuff is very, very robust. And on a practical level, from our definition, hopefully you'll consider the ABCDEs of the disease, which is inability to consistently abstain, impairment in behavioral control, cravings. And I think A and B and C would be familiar to you if you're looking at addiction. But D and E, which is the diminished recognition of problems and the dysfunctional emotional response, often people don't realize and often get other psychiatric diagnoses for, when it really is part of the disease. And that's what I can say. Most of our work day to day, individual and group psychotherapy, is related to the D and the E. And A, B, C, and E are especially engaged when people are active in their disease visibly, but the D and the E are lifelong parts of the disease. And this is the core of why relapse happens. But with abstinence and recovery action, the presence, power, and impact declines. And that's what we mean when we were talking about recovery or ending addiction. And here's the other comment about genetics, that there's no untainted gene pool in the world when it comes to addiction. So we all have the predisposition. And people have been trying to see how can we measure that and then give you some sense of whether you're at risk or not. To me, it's not necessarily needed, because each of us can say what is the best we can do recovery-wise and then deal with the disease if and when it pops out. That is true prevention and living in recovery. This I'll just scoot over because you've heard this. Behaviors are not the disease, nor do they cause the disease. They are symptoms of the disease. And behaviors can aggravate the disease or help lead to recovery. And behavioral repression helps emotional, social, and spiritual growth if action is taken. So recovery action is essential. In this area, what you do or don't do has serious effects. It's not as easy as the physical part of the body healing itself. And all these other problem behaviors and wanting more is related to the dopamine issue. And I think I might just skip over this. This is the way we used to treat substance abusing patients, make them, and I'll skip over this, but this one is important, that in continuing care model now, we do withdrawal management and continuing care. So those are two things, and I hope you're also taking home the message that because the disease has so many different facets, even when you're through the drug and alcohol part of the withdrawal, you may be affected by addiction beyond substances where you will go through withdrawal again. And because withdrawal is rooted in memory, without ever using drugs or alcohol again, through the environmental triggers, you may get withdrawal symptoms again. So this becomes also a part that you need to pay attention to. But of course, if you're looking at biopsychosocial spiritual balance, that'll continue to happen. Similar idea with harm reduction. We have polarization in our society, harm reduction or abstinence. But I hope you're hearing the message that harm reduction can be a means to an end. So when I said to Corey that keep coming back, even if you're using, let's talk about it. Just that contact leads to decreasing use. The person increases in awareness. Other areas of the brain, they start to function a little bit better, and they're able to make better decisions. And that's where medications, as Howard said too, we can't have medication yes, and that's a good thing, or medication no is a good thing. We all need to look at it in context, and what medication for how long. Which is why people sometimes get confused. People say, are you an abstinence doctor? I say yes. And they say, but I've heard you talk about harm reduction. I say yes. They say, are you medication doctor? I say yes. But you're against medication. I say yes. So we need to keep the spectrum open and treat all of these things as a means to an end, because there's only one end, and that is recovery. And that's where this slide says harm reduction is treatment and prevention approach that encompasses individual and public health needs, aiming to decrease the health and socioeconomic costs. This is an official definition of harm reduction that is posted on the ASAM website, so you can take a look at it and hopefully embrace. Similarly with definition of abstinence, it is more than not using the substance. It's the intentional and consistent restraint from the pathological pursuit of reward and or relief. So if you're in recovery and you need pain medication, have you broken your abstinence? No. If you're doing it under parameters where you're still pursuing restraint intentionally and consistently under the guidance of our doctor. So those are concepts that are so important that we have a long ways to go to operationalize them for people to embrace. Similarly, abstinence alone is not enough, because recovery requires more. We've also established the definition of relapse. Establish the idea that relapse is a process. It's not just an event. And I've taken some of the slides out, but basically at HUM, if you come there, you'll be, and those who are coming on IOP next week, they'll get reminded over and over again that the actual physical relapse is preceded by the social relapse, which is preceded by the thinking relapse, which is preceded by the emotional relapse, which is preceded by the spiritual relapse. So if we truly want to prevent relapse, we have to address psychosocial spiritual stuff and not just get focused on don't use, which is a problem that family members often get caught in both ways, meaning they get over-involved with trying to monitor drug and alcohol use, or get complacent when someone is not using. So it is the recovery part that I hope you'll take home. I won't read through this definition in the interest of time. It is on the website, so I hope you'll take a look. Similarly, relapse at the brain level, Elliot Gardner, who's the scientific advisor of FAMH, this is his research encapsulated in that sentence. George Koob, who was the scientific editor of the Journal of Addiction Medicine until recently, he's now the director of National Institute on Alcoholism and Alcohol Abuse. This is his research that we incorporated into the definition, all part of what is posted on the website. And this idea that the disease is progressive. So even apart from aging, rather in conjunction with aging, if these circuits are left to run amok, then the disease progresses. Even with recovery, there is some natural disease progression that happens, which I hope people don't take as bad news, but rather as good news, because it means you can work on recovery, and it's a reminder to keep working on recovery. And this particular slide, I just want to highlight, while tolerance develops to the high, tolerance does not develop to the emotional low, which is why as the disease progresses, the lows keep getting lower and lower. And this is an answer to people who say addiction is a choice. It is not a choice. And this is a brain problem that unfortunately, if people don't pay attention to, those people who have this disease recognize this. Although, as Corey said in his opening, even there we get lots of patients who say, well, calling it a disease is a cop-out. I created this problem, I should be able to solve the problem. And when someone says that, we say, would you consider that's your disease talking? Where are you in that? And sometimes it takes a long time to get people into where they're at rather than just whatever the disease is telling them. Similarly with medication, there's a term called medication-assisted treatment that's become very popular, MAT. We've been trying to popularize medication-assisted recovery while acknowledging that medication-assisted treatment is another variation which sometimes downplays recovery, but we need to highlight recovery. Maintenance treatments, I've mentioned a little bit about. Readiness to change becomes important as part of the assessment, whether someone is resistant, ambivalent, or taking action. And as we do the assessment, and if I can continue to use Corey's example, Corey went from, and I never saw you when you were resistant, you were still open, but you were ambivalent. You were ambivalent for a long time, but you went into action. And that's where we never know, because the flip happens too. When people are in action, and sometimes what we call euphemistically, they get cured. They think they've figured it all out. And that's what Howard was talking about, that old-timers in AA have that problem sometimes, that their disease is active in other areas apart from alcohol, and they don't come for help because they think they should be better. When in reality, we all need the willingness to get the help we need and stay in action, because this is a chronic disease and it's a progressive disease. Now, recovery you guys know a lot about. I'll leave you to read this on your own in the interest of time, but perhaps consider this recovery egg. This is how biopsychosocial spiritual comes together. And those of you who have come to Hum have seen this, and we have a poster. And this particular slide too, I could talk for an hour on, because the idea of being, becoming, and belonging, which is a very practical thing, is actually connected to some Vedic concepts that those of you who are coming on IOP, and I know you're in the audience, you'll hear more about next week. So holistic recovery, very briefly, involves biological part of recovery, psychological part of recovery, social part of recovery, 12-step meetings, and RARE, which I'll mention in closing. And really, it's from isolation to connectedness. But even there, just social recovery doesn't fix problems either. So we have to address the biopsychospiritual as well. And spiritual is where we do start to connect with the rest of the universe and rest of the people around, which goes beyond just social connection. We've defined remission. I'll skip over that. But I do want to mention sobriety, which is, sobriety is a state that can be achieved when you have abstinence plus recovery. And the way we've done it in the American Society of Addiction Medicine is abstinence as defined by ASAM. This doesn't require that you are now completely opioid free if you need opioids for whatever reason, or if you need any other medication for whatever reason, that can still fit under the abstinence umbrella. Last few slides, I'll finish in a minute. Addictions or addiction. And I've tried to color code it, so on the website you'll be able to see it, that if you start to look at addiction as a primary disease rather than addictions, the whole focus shifts. And that's where that argument that disease is a cop-out just doesn't apply, because when you're dealing with addiction, you're taking personal responsibilities for boundaries and interdependence in all aspects of your life. That's where responsibility lies. And it goes back to the serenity prayer, that you stop trying to control things that you cannot and focus on the things you can. Because if the first part of the serenity prayer is not done, you'll never get to the second part. Next slide highlights the comprehensive approach and the problems that ongoing use of alcohol, drugs, gambling, relationship problems, depending on what is not addressed, makes the disease progress faster. And the biopsychosocial spiritual instability, because of ongoing reinforcement of the reward circuitry, continues to happen, and the spiritual growth is hampered. So rare recovery is something that got started in 2006 in Kingston. When I left there, it was something that my patients requested, and it is still going here in Calgary. What we came to realize is it still requires support. And basically what it means is, it doesn't matter what kind of problems you have, drugs, trauma, sympathy, rescue issues, because they all cause more damage. And those are the issues that are addressed in rare groups. And rumination, we address a lot, being in victim, fighting, being stuck in trauma. On the other hand, survivors celebrate recovery with empathy and personal responsibility. And later on this afternoon, you're welcome to ask more questions. But this one summary slide basically outlines what RARE stands for. There are 9 steps. It's my own personal joke about war on drugs. It's willingness, action, responsible. the WAR. The first three steps are about willingness, next three are about action, and the last three are about responsibility. And there's other fun stuff. We had the founding council meeting in Kingston, as I mentioned, on 2006, April 2nd, and it is something that's growing and developing here in Calgary. Thank you for your attention. There's always hope. This is sunrise over Mount Vesuvius. I took this picture from a cruise ship in 2001.